Hello there, and welcome to today's live reading of Murder in the Lightning Room by A.D. Brazeau. This is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Colorado Springs, 1899. The body on the flagstone lay at an odd angle. The man's left arm was unnaturally bent behind him, his back twisted. Other than my father resting in quiet repose, I'd never seen a dead body outside a casket at a funeral. I stood frozen to my spot, staring at the crumpled figure. There was glass on the walkway, blood pooling around the man's head. I'd never seen anything so grotesque. What do I do? A woman's scream, loud and piercing, snapped me back to reality. An older lady, tiny, like a bird, ran down the front steps of the boarding house. She bent over the man on the ground. "I'll get the police," I called out. I tried to turn, but was tripped up by the hem of my dress. I took hold of my dress, and my swift feet carried me across the street. The county jail wasn't far. In a town where nothing ever happened, I should easily find some help. My uneventful morning of house calls with the city's dowagers had turned dramatic in an instant. I wasn't quite ready to think on what I had seen, so I pushed the ugly vision from my mind, running down the side of the wet road. A policeman stood outside the jail, milling about as he seemed to enjoy the shining sun on his cold morning. I was about to change his day for the worse. A few men in suits, no doubt from the bank, gawked as I raced by. Society girls were not often seen barreling towards officers of the law. I stopped shy of ramming into the squat man. "Sir, please come with me. There's been a terrible accident," I gasped, the words rushing out in a tumble. The officer, startled at first, recovered himself with aplomb. "Lead the way," he said, his breath moving the fine hairs of his long mustache. If the two of us speeding back toward the boarding house appeared odd to the town's residents, I couldn't be bothered to notice. I ran ahead, holding up my long skirts until I stood on the very spot I had only moments before. A small crowd now gathered around the dead man and the bird-like woman who sat on her knees next to the corpse. The officer left me where I rested to take command of the situation. I remained for a moment. I wanted to help, but what more could I do? I hadn't seen the man fall, and I hadn't heard anything either. As I stood, watching the officer direct people, some heathen honked the horn of his motor car, startling two horses pulling a buggy in front of him. As I seemed forgotten in the chaos, and with no other options, I went about my business. Staring was distasteful. I shivered in the early morning air. Winter would come early this year. There was already a fine dusting of snow on Pike's Peak, visible in the distance behind the house where the tragedy had occurred. The blue and white of the mountains drew my eye. The dead man would never look on it again. My chest tightened at the thought. It was a view I, too, was in danger of losing. I would, if all went according to my plan, be leaving soon to further my education. Mother wanted me to attend Colorado College, mere blocks from home. I wasn't so sure I wanted to. I wished to travel, to see more of life than our small, comfortable world afforded. But in that instant, part of me wanted nothing more than to go home and crawl back into bed. The incident with the dead man left a bad taste in my mouth. However, Mr. Hill wouldn't be happy if I were late to class, no matter the circumstance, so I hurried on, all the while thinking, who was the poor man? How could he have ended up as he did? Whatever happened, I hoped he hadn't suffered. Walters, our stableman, waited a block away with the buggy. As I rounded the corner, the scent of afternoon coffee wafting from the cafe, he caught me in his eye. There was disapproval written all over the lines of his forehead. He continued to watch me with a scowl until I stood in front of him. Walters was a tall man, in no way bent from his many years of work in the carriage house. His back was as straight as any 20-year-old's, and his hair, though white, was full and thick. "Miss Cora," he began, "you're going to be late. We better get a move on." He held out a steady arm as I climbed into the back of the transom. "I know, Walters, you'll never believe what happened. A man fell to his death from one of the boarding houses on Cascade. I had to run for help." Walters stood with his hands on his hips, shaking his head. "That's a shame, miss. Sorry you had to see it. Are you all right?" I nodded, swallowing the knot I only then noticed forming in the back of my throat. It was a shocking sight to see. The woman's piercing screams, along with the man's twisted and bloody body, would haunt my dreams. My mind wandered to the death of my father, of grasping his lifeless cold hand, a hand that once was so warm and strong. Life was so quickly over, and not always in the way we anticipated. Father hadn't expected for his heart to fail, and that man hadn't expected to slip from wherever he slipped from. Walters alighted onto the driver's box, and we were off. The cold air whipped around me as Walters and Lady, my favorite mare, made tracks to the school. We weren't far, but Mother hated when I walked in the mornings, as it was usually still dark when I left for school. Since I had visits to return today, I had started out a bit later. I pressed myself into the back of the seat as far as I could, pulling the fur blanket over my shaking legs. The leaves, already falling, would be gone soon. The trees lining the streets, green and full in the summer, were days away from being stripped stark and bare for winter. I didn't mind the cold, but this weather made me feel bleak on the best of days. After witnessing such a scene on the street, this was not the best of days. Something felt off in this small city of ours. Chapter 2. Mr. Hill had lost his mind. Tesla? The Tesla? I stared at my teacher. Has he gone mad? The wooden chair I'd sat in for the last 2 hours was uncomfortable, but I had to finish our conversation. Yes, Cora, the Tesla. Mr. Hill paused, pursing his lips as if in thought. Your studies here are coming to an end, and you said you wanted a challenge before college. There's no greater challenge, I'm told, than assisting Nikola Tesla in his lab. Mr. Hill chuckled, shaking his head at a joke only he understood. The thought of working with and learning from a genius of Tesla's magnitude would be a dream come true. Tesla had been here since the beginning of the summer and probably wouldn't be here forever. His lab east of the city center had drawn more than a few onlookers in its early days. The townspeople of Colorado Springs were enthralled by the famous man and his incredible work, as people were the world over. Snow drifted past the windows. The flurries began about an hour ago. It was still light out, so I could see people outside, dressed against the weather, driving their buggies and riding their horses around the park, which stood like a little oasis in the center of town. My brow creased. I pondered what Mr. Hill was saying. Would he accept a female assistant? I asked as I tucked straight tendrils of dark brown hair behind my ear. There was a chill in the classroom. Desks were lined in long rows, chairs neatly pushed in. Chalk dust still hung in the air from the freshly wiped board and mingled with the scent of ink and paper. A great map of the world hung from the wall opposite the windows. I spent a lot of time gazing with dreamy eyes at the different countries and cities, wondering where I would travel first when my life began in earnest. Tesla seems to be unaware of things like gender. His only interest is his work. All you need to do is prove yourself capable, which I'm sure you will. He recently fired an assistant and needs a replacement as soon as possible. Think about what it is you wish to accomplish, Cora. Could this help you? Mr. Hill extricated himself from the small half-desk, stretching his back as he did so. He was looking stiffer, older this year. His hair, which was dark when I first began at Colorado Springs High School, was now mostly white. His smooth skin still appeared youthful, though, and this made me smile. I knew he was likely exhausted from his day of teaching and would appreciate it if I went on home, so I stood, smoothing down the satin of my dark blue day dress, gathering the rest of my things. You know I wish to teach at a great college one day, sir. Even if this is a profession for men, it won't always be so. Tesla's name would help me open a few doors. The only thing I'm not sure of is the time commitment. Why don't you assist Mr. Tesla, Mr. Hill? My teacher smiled as he walked over to the brass coat rack. Mrs. Hill thinks I'm away from home too much as it is. Besides, I can't stand for long hours anymore. Teaching is becoming a burden on my legs these days. He removed my knit scarf, passing it to me. I took the scarf, wound it around my neck, and sighed. I'll think about it. I'm not sure I'd be any use to him. My interests are less in electrical engineering and more in biological sciences. Yes, I know. Still, it's a great opportunity, Cora. Think about it, but don't take too long. Another day or two, and he'll be expecting his new assistant. Mr. Hill held open my coat, and I turned around to slip in my arms. One thing before you meet him, if you so decide. Tesla has a fair few eccentricities, not unusual for a man like him. Don't be alarmed. Take them in stride. He's intense, but harmless. I didn't find this comforting. In fact, this last bit of information set my mind even more resolutely against the idea. There were other ways to gain some experience before I began applying for colleges. The frigid silk lining of my coat sent a shiver through my limbs. I knew the cold of the room was nothing compared to what I would feel when the icy wind hit my face outside. A little snow didn't scare me if it didn't get too deep. The fresh air would do me good, help me focus my thoughts, and when I arrived home, Willow would delight in a snowy romp. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I'll let you know what I decide. Mr. Hill accompanied me to the outside. I tugged on my gray gloves as we walked. Cora, where's Mr. Walters with the buggy? Mr. Hill looked up and down the street. The snow fell harder now, the giant snowflakes collecting on our shoulders and the tops of our hats. The feather in my silk bonnet would need replacing, that is, if the hat was found to be salvageable. I told him not to come back for me. I wanted to walk home. I had begged Walters not to come for me, but knowing he and Mother would both fret at the weather conditions, I wouldn't be surprised if I were to run into him along the way. Mr. Hill's brow creased with worry as he now looked up into the sky. "I'll be fine, sir. I love the snow, and the cold doesn't bother me." I pulled up the collar of my coat as far as I could. I realized I had made a mistake. The weather was worsening by the second, but I didn't want to give Mr. Hill too much time to worry over my predicament, so I began walking west toward home. "Good night, Mr. Hill. Stay warm." I laughed to relieve his anxiety and mine. Mr. Hill had only about 1 block to walk to his neat home on Boulder Avenue, whereas I had about 2 miles. I normally enjoyed the 40-minute walk when the weather was fine. This evening stroll would prove more difficult. I did enjoy the snow to a point, but I was a rational woman and knew I would be soaked through by the time I arrived home. As I walked parallel to the park, stubbornness took over. As long as I kept the flakes from slipping past the barrier of my scarf, freezing me like a block of ice from the inside out, I would be fine. The sun began to descend. Within the hour, it would be falling away behind the snow-carved ridges of the Rocky Mountains. I would have liked to walk faster, but the sidewalks were wet and slick underneath my soles. My new boots were unlikely to survive the night. These were a gift from my mother, and their ruination would give her another reason to wish for a more socially glamorous daughter. I fretted over my frigid predicament as I crossed Nevada Avenue and trudged toward Tejon Street. There was still quite a long way to go. I was certainly a fool to insist on walking. At the next corner, a buggy pulled up next to me, splashed me with slushy muck from the road. "Yuck," I groaned. "Cora, what on earth are you doing?" a familiar voice yelled down at me. Snowflakes caked my lashes, making it difficult to see. I attempted to blink through the white fluff. Of all the people to come along at a moment like this, of course, it would be him. Harrison Byrne was the most irritating boy in my year at school. Harrison moved to town less than 12 months ago and insisted on calling me Cora, rather than Miss Croft, as was polite. I frowned. "Walking, obviously, Mr. Byrne. If you don't mind, I've a long way to go and I'm already frozen to the bone." I turned on my boot heel to leave. As I did so, my foot slid out from under me and I tumbled sharply onto the hard ground, hip first. A dull pain jammed its way into my back and down my leg. I moved to my other side in an attempt to rise when I felt strong hands take hold under my arms. "Steady now. I bet that hurt." Harrison Byrne stood behind me, holding onto my arms, breathing down into my ear. I was sore but more annoyed with myself for falling in front of him. What frustrated me even more was that I needed and was accepting his help to stand. I squeezed my eyes shut, allowing Harrison to pull me up to my feet. "I'm fine, thank you." I wanted to mention how I never would have fallen at all had he not distracted me, but I didn't quite have the energy. Instead, I massaged my hip. "Good," Harrison breathed, again in my ear, sending a chill I didn't need down my spine. He continued to hold me by one arm around the waist. "Get in, I'll take you home." Stubborn wasn't something I could afford to be in this situation. If I insisted on walking, I would never make it. Continuing to rub my hip, I sighed, stepping out of Harrison's protective grasp. "Yes, thank you. I'm sorry if I was rude before." I wasn't all that sorry, but I wanted more than anything to get in the buggy. Harrison chuckled as he held out his hand for me to take. He helped me into the back of the open-air buggy. I would continue to get wet, but would be home much quicker, so I wouldn't be such a fool as to complain. The well-used carriage belonged to Harrison, who drove people around after school for money. I didn't know much else about him except that he lived with his family east of the center town. "Where am I taking you, Cora?" Harrison seated himself on the box and half turned, one eyebrow raised, ginger locks sweeping his forehead. He had a look about him I wasn't sure I liked. "I live on Wood Avenue, Mr. Byrne. Head north and I'll direct you as we go." A slow heat started to burn in my cheeks. I wanted nothing more than for Harrison to turn back around. This wasn't the first time he'd had this effect on me. More than once, I'd caught him staring at me when he should have been more focused on Mr. Hill's lecture. Each time, I had the same reaction. After a moment too long, Harrison turned back to the large brown stallion, flicked his wrist, and clucked his tongue. As we drove, I observed him from behind. His pageboy hat wasn't doing much to keep the snow off his face and shoulders. His thick, knee-length canvas jacket seemed much more weather-resistant as the flakes of snow collected on the surface of the material without being absorbed. "It was lucky for me you came along," I blurted out, upset with myself for not being able to sit in silence. I crammed a gloved hand into my mouth to stifle any further observations. Harrison looked back. "It wasn't luck. I was on my way home, and Mr. Hill flagged me down. Said you had some crazy notion of walking home in this mess. I shifted in my seat. Oh, I see. Well, I'm grateful to him and to you. I suppose I didn't think it was quite so bad. We passed several businesses and homes lining the streets one after the next in almost perfect uniformity as we made our way out of the center of town. I looked up at the dull gray sky. The snow was picking up along with the wind, coming down sideways in thick, cotton-like wisps. Pulling up my scarf around my ears, I settled further into the back of the seat. This was the most snow we'd had in a long while. The weather in Colorado was often unpredictable. My mother always said you could never get too comfortable, and just because the day began one way did not mean it would end the same. I shook, the air against my wet skin like icy shrapnel to my senses. Almost there, Harrison called ahead. I took a deep breath. I would soon be warm again. I peered around Harrison's body. Colorado College was a welcome sight. This meant we were close to home. Harrison continued until we were finally trotting down Wood Avenue. The pleasant, tree-lined street was quiet, smoke billowing from the chimneys of every fine house we passed. The streets were double wide so carriages could turn around. There it is, I yelled, an octave too high. My voice cracked, betraying the excitement I felt to be at home. Composing myself, I continued. The White House with the gray shutters. Relief flooded my senses as the buggy came to a stop in front of my home. The imposing Queen Anne structure had been designed by my father, built for my mother as an anniversary gift. The steeply pitched roof was topped with an elaborately decorated gable on top of which had been erected a wrought iron spire. As a child, I always kept one eye on the thing, terrified the spire would break off and impale me. Conversely, the expansive wrap-around porch was designed with figure-8-shaped posts I delighted in tracing with my hand while I raced around the perimeter, chased by my father as we played tag. Without waiting for Harrison, I stepped out of the buggy, alighting onto the snow-covered cobblestones, my limbs shaking with cold. With trembling hands, I reached into my purse. No charge. The only payment I need is the knowledge I got you home safe. Before I could respond, I heard the sharp voice of my mother behind me. Cora Croft! Where on earth have you been in this blizzard? I'm sick with worry, and I was about to send Walters out to find you. I turned to see Mother dressed for the evening meal in elegant black silk, rushing down the walk with nothing to cover her bare arms. My mother, Isabella, looked anything but sick. As usual, she glowed with life. Her wrinkleless skin was luminescent in the lamplight, every hair perfectly coiffed. I'm fine, Mother. Coming in now. I swiveled around to say goodbye to Harrison as Mother moved alongside me and cut off.